It's now 19 minutes after 7. This is Morning Express, and it's time for us to get into the topic of the day, and it's to do with disaster management. And we've had quite a number of disasters that Kenya has experienced in the not too distant future. And of course, one that many of us cannot forget easily is the one that recently took place, where we already have 40 lives lost and still some missing. And that is to do with the Patel Dam in Nakuru County. And of course, still details trickling in of some of those who are missing, and the government scaling down, and a lot, of course, has been going on. And joining me to have that conversation this morning, I have Brian Mutie with me right here. And Brian, maybe just to start off, of course, it's very unfortunate and very sad that we've had to lose Kenyans in rather difficult times. For instance, with Solai, we've also had floods. You remember there was the Kijiji disaster in Langata not too long ago, where we had 6,000 families who were left homeless. We had a number of deaths there as well. Your general outlook of how we've handled disasters so far?
Thank you, Mike. I think to me, we have become a reactionary nation when disasters strike. As much as disasters do not knock, but there are always those symptoms or those signs which are normally called early warning signs, which we are normally supposed to, read between the lines and understand what mitigative measures are appropriate to counter the effects in the event that disasters strike. And I think from a chronology of events that have hit this country, not from the bomb blast, not from floods, not from fire ranges and all that, I think we ought to have learned key lessons on how we are supposed to go about the whole process of disaster, planning, all the way to evacuation, all the way to post-disaster management issues. And as a country, I do appreciate that we are over-regulated when it comes to matters of disaster management. And people have been asking, why are we not having laws that can govern the issues of management of disasters? But I want to say that we have good laws. We have good departments that are elaborate. And first to start with is actually the NDOC, which was actually known as the National Disaster Operations Center, which was established after the country was hit by huge torrents of El Nino in the years of 1997, 1998. And when that unit was established, of course, it was given some impetus when the country was hit by the issues of bomb blast at the cooperative center of Fundi. And after that, I think the country saw the need to have this body to manage disasters in the event that they hit our country. And from there, I think we have just taken a nosedive in terms of a lackluster sort of approach when it comes to matter of disaster, where we forgot that we have a unit which is capable of doing the same, which needs some sort of impetus in terms of finance, in terms of, that sectoral cementing and also strengthening in terms of synergies and the collaborations and the partners, as well as the players of non-state actors, to make it look a formidable outfit to deal with disasters in this country. And therefore, it's a matter of just, looking at ways of strengthening the aspect of disaster management unit or operations in this country, but not an issue of policy, because policies are there. But I also want to mention one very important legal framework, which has always been a talk of the town, but it has never seen the light of the day. And this was a policy or a bill which was being sponsored by one Tia Galgalo, the immediate former Isiolo women rep, who wanted to have the National Disaster Management unit for that matter, or framework or bill for that matter. But unfortunately, she exited the political arena when she had not actually seen the light of it. And it's unfortunate that such kind of an important bill did not see the light of the day.
All right, and allow me to bring in Sylvia Kamati now, who's the head of health at Red Cross. Thank you for joining us this morning. And from your experience, you're one who deals or is very close to the ground when some of these disasters take place. Maybe your opening remarks on how we handle disasters in this country so far.
Thank you very much. I think I will start by really appreciating the efforts put in by the government, especially the statement made by the head of state yesterday in terms of looking at how to support further the Kenya Red Cross in response to emergencies, which I think is a good gesture and we appreciate. I think disaster management in the country has been a lot of talk, but very little action done in terms of preparing and planning for emergencies. We have a lot of very good ideas as a country, but the problem is we don't implement them. So we always talk about planning, but every time there is an emergency, we don't seem to be prepared to be able to respond
and what
to
do you think makes us unprepared? Because really, we've had a number of emergencies that should already have gotten our clocks ready, such that should there be a disaster, I mean, like Red Cross, you go to a place prepared. I imagine when you appear, you go with certain, what I'd call minimum requirements. You'll have certain things in place that you have as a disaster. What is it that stops us from getting there, do you think?
I think one is, as my colleague has mentioned, we don't have the key legislation that would drive the planning and preparedness for emergencies in the country. So the bill that would actually be able to give the authority behind organizations to plan for emergencies is still lacking. So if we're able to have that act in place, that would be very nice. Then also we do have you know, in Kenya Red Cross, we do something we call contingency planning and preparedness planning. This is not a culture in most of the other institutions that work on emergencies. So you find in most of the times, like right now, you know, we were looking at some of the county development plans that the counties are working on, and you realize emergency is not appearing in any of those CIDPs. So that would mean that there is no planning for emergencies.
Correct.
So when an emergency strikes, it becomes an emergency itself to start responding to it. But what we want to implore governments to do is we need to have that culture of planning. Have contingency plans ready, have your CIDPs with emergencies in them, and then you are able to allocate resources for the same.
All right, Brian?
Yep, as I was saying, I was actually saying, talking about the issue of resources being inadequate. I think with Tia Galgalo-sponsored bill, which ought to have established the National Disaster Management Unit in this country, would have actually seen the issue of disaster management trickling down to the counties, and also the establishment of the National Disaster Management Fund. That fund would have actually been, you know, ring-fenced in a way that it is actually part of the government, the processes of mitigating disasters, and also at the same time, counties also, you know, following suit. But it's unfortunate that at a time like this, we are grappling with such a simple legislative piece of art, which can only be, you know, being worked upon by, you know, willing, you know, partners in the parliament who can actually find a way of actually fast-tracking on this piece of legislation. But again, actually going back to matters of Solai and the people that we saw over 40 losing their lives, which is unfortunate because, of course, all the early warning signs were there, and the mitigation measures ought to have been taken earlier in advance. And, of course, the issue of other complacency, aspects of complacency by other agencies who are partners or who are very directly involved in this, such as NEMA, who I'm told that they had already given some, you know, early warnings that this dam is upstream and it is actually posing some potential, you know, risk to the people who are downstream. And therefore, measures ought to have been taken and enforcement has to have been done at that point. And evacuation, you know, ought to have also been communicated to the people that there is a danger which is posing. And of course, the reading was on the wall that with this kind of high torrentials being pounding the country across, it was actually in the best interest to start giving those people some communication and warnings and finding ways of evacuating them early in advance so that they are not affected by what they have been affected. So to me, I think it's unfortunate. And of course, there's also the legal aspect in terms of a connotation of somebody who is culpable, because if that was a private firm, somebody who had actually established that dam upstream, he actually knew very well that that posed some risk to the people, and he ought to have actually taken, you know, something. He ought to have initiated something to ensure the lives of the people are not affected potentially.
All right. Sylvia, what are some of the bare minimums that you would expect from government for us to be, I guess one can never be really ready for a disaster because you don't know what's going to happen and how it's going to come, and it could be anything. Could be a fire, could be a flood, could be mudslides that we have seen, could be an accident. But what are some of those bare minimums that one would have as a first aid kit of sorts in terms of preparedness for disaster?
I think it would go by disaster by disaster. It would really be, you know, tailored to each of the emergencies. But I think generally what is needed is really having in place a contingency plan that can be able to be quickly triggered when there is an emergency. Also looking at mapping what are some of these emergencies that would strike which population and preparing that population. Now, I'm looking at countries like the US.
Right.
They're always struck with things like hurricanes that are much more powerful than the floods we are having. But those populations, you'd hear very few fatalities that would happen. And because there is a deliberate effort to educate the individuals to understand when a hurricane comes, you need to do 1, 2, 3, 4. So I think we also need to do something like that for our populations. We always know that, for example, the Tana River will always burst its banks. It's a fact. Every year it has to happen. But what effort have we put in place to be able to ensure that the people around Tana River know what to do when it strikes? And where do they go when it strikes? I know there are efforts that have been put in place, for example, like Budalangi and the Nyando River, where evacuation centers have been established. Maybe something like that needs to be done in most of these areas. Establish a place where people can go and get rescue as the issue is happening. Then when it settles down, they go back to where they were staying and start staying again. So I think the whole issue of having a plan in place to educate the public and also ensuring that there are allocated resources to be able to respond when there is an emergency. But also just looking at, how do we coordinate response? I think there should be a minimum of how we coordinate response, which I think of late the government has done a fantastic job in terms of pulling together actors, but I think more still needs to be done in terms of having in place these structures even before an emergency.
All right, Brian, one of the impediments that may hinder disaster being taken care of as fast as it should, which could add to the fatalities, is probably resources. But we do know that there is a disaster management fund that is specifically for that. Do you feel that it is well executed and managed? Especially when now the disasters take place?
I think the disaster management fund you are talking about ought to have been operationalized by the National Disaster Management Bill or Act of Parliament if it saw the light of the day. But now that has not been established, I think that's where the lacuna is. But I also believe that the government had set some amount to the tune of over 5 billion shillings when we had actually been given the early warning signs that El Nino was actually in the knocking. But what became of that fund, I think it's the responsibility of the government to explain to the people what happened of it, because, of course, Kenyans would want to have answers, because that money was actually to cushion Kenyans against the eventualities of any disaster that would strike as a result of El Nino. But having said that, I think all is not lost, because I think members of parliament of this country are pretty aware that disaster is something that now cannot be taken for, right? And they have to put the country into a top gear when it comes to mitigation measures when a disaster strike. And the best approach for them to do is actually to fast track on the National Disaster Management Bill, which eventually would become an act of parliament that would now operationalize the National Disaster Management Fund and also trickle down to the counties, and the counties will be able to have the authority and audacity to inculcate these provisions in the CIDPs, which are normally called the County Integrated Development Programs. And these CIDPs now will give breath of life now to counties to have to ring fence some funds in the events that a disaster strike. And they'll be able to move with a lot of speed to mitigate on this, together with the partners and state actors, of course, like the Red Cross and other players who are always at hand to work with the government in times like that, of course. And it's very important for us to understand that as much as we are talking about legal framework missing, I think to me that is the starting point for us on where we are supposed to.
All right, Sylvia, the importance of having this devolved, because you'll find like now, for instance, the time it takes to even, for instance, allocate funds to a certain disaster when it's coming from the national government may take time, whereas the locals would probably be able to do that because they're in touch with that. The importance now that we are under a new constitution, 2010, with devolved governments, would there be an importance to focus on that?
I think disaster is a devolved function. It is a devolved function, and the counties are required to allocate 2% of their funds to respond to emergencies. I think it also zeroes down to the fact that even if the funds are allocated, how are they operationalized?
Right.
How are they then made available when there is an emergency? There are counties that have done a good job, I must say. Counties where you've had disasters striking, and they've quickly turned around in terms of getting supplies to the people affected and putting in place response mechanisms. But I think this needs to be institutionalized and be made to be something that is thought through properly. And that's why we are mentioning things like the CIDPs, because if you have all the 47 CIDPs lacking emergency preparedness, so even if that 2% fund is there, it lacks structures to operationalize it. So I think the most important thing is looking at how do we operationalize disaster preparedness and response at the county level, because it's a devolved function. It's really something that the counties should take head on.
All right, and Brian, I know you want to say something briefly, but I'd like us to take a short break.
Absolutely. I think it's unfortunate that some counties have been actually moving the so-called disaster funds to other activities simply because disasters have not struck at that particular time, only to be caught unawares when a disaster strikes. And I have an example of a county like Makueni, of course, which I'm told that it moved some of its funds from disaster to other activities only to be caught unawares when a disaster hit. And therefore, it had to now start looking for partners and other well-wishers to, supplement what the little they had. So it's important for, as my colleague has said, for counties to be pretty aware that disasters do not knock, apart from the early warning signs that they have to read between the walls, so that they can understand how much to allocate in terms of resources and what to allocate during their, budgetary planning, which would enable them actually to give something, tangible for disaster management or preparedness. But also the issue of, disaster planning is very key for counties. And I'm told that counties which are prone to these vulnerabilities, such as floods, such as Northeastern and other counties, I think it's important also they find the place of non-state actors where they can work together in terms of identifying the risk vulnerabilities and the people who are likely to be hit by these disasters and find mitigation ways in terms of contingency planning, so that in the event that disasters strike, they are not really much exposed.
All right, I want us to take a short break. When we come back, I'd like us to also focus on the fact that we as Kenyans also have a responsibility. How do I react to a disaster? What is the first thing that I do when I am face to face with a disaster? We might be here waiting and hoping that the government is going to do something, but I certainly can also be a lifesaver depending on how well informed I am and how quick I am to act. And that's what we're going to be looking at right here. It's now 24 minutes to 8. We're going to take a short break. This is The Way It Is on Morning Express.